Today's Mother's Day, and I'm sure for those of you who are mothers, if you haven't yet received one, you will by the end of the day receive at least one Mother's Day card. And I don't know when the last time was that some of you spent time around the Mother's Day cards and the card aisle. Those of you dads, you may have been frantically doing it yesterday. And some of you may have been ahead of the game, got your cards earlier this week. There are some interesting cards out there. And I came across a few that I wanted to share with you. One of them is interesting. It looks like this. It says, Mother's Day. She carried you for 9 months, so at least get her a card. And then you open it up and it says, okay, 9.5 months. Yes, you told me the story about 500 times already. Happy Mother's Day, Mom. Now, one of my personal favorites is this one. I am the best accident you ever made. Happy Mother's Day. Now, there are a lot of Mother's Day cards that are out there today that I think just try to find a way to take a stab at the dads and to point out some of the things that dads might be a little deficient in. It's not the card you're about to see, but I came across one that said, hi, honey, it's Mother's Day, so sit back, pick up the remote control, whatever you want to watch on TV, watch it, whatever you want to do, do it, and then you open it up, it says, in other words, just be like me. Or there's this one, Mom, thanks for putting up with the pouting, the whining, the tantrums, and all the other spoiled, childish behavior, and then you open it up and it says, but enough about Dad, Happy Mother's Day. And then my personal favorite for this year is this one. Mom, have you ever looked at my sister and thought, we should have stopped at one child? Oh my. Today is a day that I consider to be one of the two most important days of the year for us in the church, other than Easter and Christmas. Because today, Mother's Day, like Father's Day in June, gives us an opportunity to spend some time talking about a vitally important and faith-shaping relationship in our lives. And that is the relationship between a mother and her child. And there are two scripture passages we're gonna dig into this morning to help us come to a deeper understanding of what the relationships need to look like between ourselves and other family members. Yes, we're gonna talk about moms today, but we're really talking also about the relationships that all of us have with different family members, because some of those relationships we get to embrace, some we have to embrace, and some are difficult, some are joy-filled, some are tough. And so I think it's important that we spend some time talking about those relationships with our families. The first text we're going to look at is found in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, verses 1-4. You almost heard it earlier today, were it not for all the kids telling about all their needs to the one who was supposed to read it. But hear this word now. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And fathers, or I'll include mothers in this as well, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and in the instruction of the Lord. Now, this is a pretty straightforward text, and I have to tell you that as a preacher, it's tempting to use this passage of Scripture and drive this text into the congregation like a stake in the ground. It's tempting to look at the kids in the room and say, hey, kids, the Bible says it. Honor your father and mother. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is what you're supposed to do. It's tempting to just do that. And then to look at dads, kind of like some Mother's Day cards, and say, fathers, don't be a jerk to your kids before you have the chance to make an influence in their life. I mean, it's tempting to just let that be the message and to use it like a hammer over the congregation. And at the end of the sermon, I'd feel like I'd really done something by saying something important for all of us. And yet, I can't help but believe that when it would all be said and done, after the dust settled from the sermon, all that would be left would be a bunch of people who felt beaten up by the word of the Lord. And that's not what I'm going to do today. Because quite honestly, I don't believe that that's what Paul intended when he wrote those words in Ephesians chapter 6. And I think to get at the heart of what he's talking about here, you really have to look back 13 verses earlier when Paul kind of set up this whole conversation about family relationships. He said this in Ephesians 5:21. He said, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. He went on from that verse to talk about the relationships between husbands and wives. And now he talks about the relationships between children and their parents. And he begins this whole part of his conversation to the church in Ephesus by saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Because I believe Paul considered this to be one of the foundational principles of all godly relationships. That if we will submit to one another, if we will put the other person's interests above our own, then we will be able to experience the kind of relationships that God intended for us to have. I mean, I'll tell you, every time I've put my needs ahead of other people with whom I'm in relationship, it goes south. But if we submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, we'll find the joy that God intends for us to experience in our relationships. But I got to tell you, this isn't just about submitting to one another because it's the right thing to do. This is about honoring Jesus in all of our relationships. Paul said it like this. He said, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see, at the end of the day, this is about Jesus. And about how we allow our relationship with Him to flow into the relationships that we have with those in our families. It's often been said that our greatest mission field is under the roof where we live. And I believe that to be true. Our greatest mission field is under the roof where we live. I mean, I told Katie and Logan just a little while ago that Harper's going to learn more about Jesus from the two of them than she will from anybody else on the planet during the course of her life. And I say that to every parent whose child I baptize because it's true. I mean, the church has your child 1% of the time in their life, or roughly 1% of the time in their life. The school has your child 18% of their lives. And the home has your child 80% of his or her time. So do the math. Do the math. We've got to take the time. We've got to take the time. Just this past Friday, I watched the little girl that we brought home on an apnea monitor because she was born 6 weeks early. I watched her walk across the stage at Reed Arena to receive her college diploma. 3 weeks from now, I'll watch our other daughter walk across that same stage to receive her high school diploma. And I'm just going to tell you, it goes by fast. It goes by so fast. Take the time. Take the time. I mean, if I have a regret about the childhood years of my kids, it was that there were too many times when I wasn't all there. Oh, I was there physically. But there were too many times when I was too distracted by too many things that I thought were so very important in the moment. It still happens today. We've got to take the time. John Trent has recently written a book on relationships, and I came across this book in my sermon preparation for this week. I got to tell you, I haven't preached for 2 weeks, and so I've got like 2 weeks of sermon preparation stored up. This was an hour sermon when I got ready to preach it, so I pared it down to about 55 minutes, Mike. You can just sit back. But John Trent wrote this book on relationships, and this is what he said about his mom. He said she should have been bitter and broken and frozen inside. She had every reason to be, every right to be, if you want to be politically correct. Her father had chosen to spend her childhood years far away from his family as he tried and failed to keep a dying farm from sinking into the Dust Bowl. Years later, after only a year of marriage, her husband walked into the Big Sun parlor in their house in Indiana, and he announced that their relationship was over. There was another woman. Then came a move to Phoenix so that they could see the sun again, and a new start was there. And not long thereafter, a new marriage, and then the long-awaited birth of children. 3 boys, 1 older son plus a set of twins in just 3 years. Then a repeat of the conversation in that Indiana Sun parlor. Another husband came home to say that there was another woman and he was leaving. No, there would be no further discussion. And in the future, no financial help was given to any of the children, nor was there a visit as the boys were growing up. Trent says, the 3 most significant men in my mother's life all walked away from her. Her father when she was a child, and then 2 husbands who didn't merely leave, but they underscored their sudden departures by choosing someone else over her. I find it interesting, Trent says, that God gave my mom 3 young boys to raise. I mean, did the Lord intend this as a way of making up for the missing men in her life? I'm not sure. But I do know that she could have grown up full of anger, full of hurt, full of shame and self-pity. Instead, she remained vibrant and alive, warm and loving, which always amazed me. Because it usually doesn't happen that way, he says. We live life as if it were a motion picture, says author Gerald Sitzer. He said, loss turns into a snapshot. The movement stops. Everything freezes. Trent says, that's what I've seen over the years in the lives of so many people I've counseled, people who've suffered great loss. They're like people who are shrink-wrapped and shelved by crushing failures or turned to stone inside because of grief or a love lost forever. It should have happened to my mom, he said. She should have shut down. She should have closed the book on growth and creativity and connection. If not for the people losses she suffered, then certainly for all the physical losses she experienced that just seemed to add insult to injury. Rheumatoid arthritis would twist her hands and tear up her knees and take away an outstanding career, a corporate vice presidency significant enough to merit a write-up in the Wall Street Journal, all ripped away. So too was any realistic chance of remarrying. I mean, as her bones dried up, her spirit too should have dried up and cracked and broken. She should have given up, he said, particularly on me. He said, I was the one who was asked to leave grade school for a stupid mistake. He said, I was the one who police carted home late one night. I was the one, he said, who brought home report cards so dismal that they would not even qualify me to ask the question, paper or plastic? But mom never gave up on learning. She never gave up on friends or needy people or the Lord or her sons. Without a doubt, she was the most giving, loving person I've ever known. Even in her last days, Trent says, she glowed, which was a description given by one of her hospice nurses. But why? What enabled her to carry on? What gave her the strength to continue? How could she do it, he asked. After a night of crying out in pain from the arthritis, each time she rolled over in bed, she could still greet us with a genuine smile in the morning. And for years, I wondered how. And what was it that allowed her to look beyond her own pain and her own loss and adopt hurting kids the way other people bring home stray cats? What was it that kept her mind alert and her arthritic fingers still tapping across her computer keyboard? I mean, why didn't she rev up her regrets and her hurt, put down my father in front of us, or take the counsel of Job's wife and just curse God and die? What was her secret? He says, today I realize she really did have a secret that all of us can discover and learn and use. He says, Mom had a way of continually connecting to a source of strength and energy and life and recovery and wellness that literally filled her life to overflowing. And in the process, She changed so many lives that at her funeral, the chapel couldn't begin to contain the throngs of people who wanted to come and pay her respects. In fact, there were those who couldn't get in, who hung outside during the whole funeral service. What I first saw in my mother, he says, I've seen since reflected in the lives of many courageous and authentic and empowering people of every age, race, and tax bracket. This secret helped my mom keep a positive perspective through all of her years of chronic pain and soured relationships. So what was her secret? What was it that allowed her to glow despite the tragedies in her life? In 2 words, she chose to be there for others. She lifted her eyes to others carrying even deeper hurts. The template we're given in the scriptures for how to be there, he says, is exactly what my mom followed to connect so deeply with us boys. And it's reflected in countless studies of strong families, great marriages, and deep friendships. It's a powerful word. I've personally seen how important this is. I've watched fruit grow out of the children of the woman I consider to be the greatest mom I've ever known. I happen to be married to her. She's mastered the art of being there. And she learned that from the second greatest mom I've ever known. My favorite mother-in-law, her mother. Take the time. Take the time. Be there. Be there emotionally. But also be there spiritually. Proverbs 22:6 says this: train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it. Now, I got to tell you, that verse doesn't actually teach what you may have always thought that verse teaches. I've always read that text. I've heard people preach on this text, and they've talked about it like this. You know, you're the parent. You know what's right. He or she is a child. You train them up in the right way. You've been taught how to live. You impart that onto them. Train them up in the right way. That means you got to get them to church on Sundays. You got to get them into camps. You got to get them into Bible studies. You got to get them into youth groups. You got to get them into Sunday schools. Because that's the way you were raised and it worked for you, and you need to do that for your kids. So train them up in the right way. But listen to this. It says train up. Did you notice? Not jerk up. I've known too many people who were raised with an iron fist, and as soon as they had an opportunity to get free, they went wild. That's why preachers' kids get the bad rap that preachers' kids get. It wasn't me, obviously. I was never like that. But I've seen some preachers' kids that just go crazy because their parents just kept a finger on them their whole life. It says, train up your child in the way they should go. What I found to be interesting was that the word train up actually refers to the work of a midwife. And a midwife in Jesus' day, and in the Old Testament days, a midwife, when the baby was born, would, right after the baby was born, the midwife would dip her finger in a bowl of crushed dates and fruit and put that finger into the baby's mouth, and it would cause the baby, the tartness of the fruit would cause the baby to suck. And it would develop that sucking sensation in the child's mouth and kind of cleanse the palate. And it came, this act, training up, came to mean the act of cultivating a thirst. Which says to me that the parent's immediate task is to create in our children a thirst for God. We were at our Empty Nesters group this past Wednesday, or a couple Wednesday nights ago, and one of the people, we were talking about how important it is to lead our children to faith, to impart faith onto our kids. And one of the people sitting around the room said, you know, it's a prayer that we need that we ought to bring our children to pray, that says, I'm a child of God. I'm a child of God. I have received him, but I want more. I'm a child of God. I'm a child of God. I've received him, but I want more. Do you see that cultivation of a thirst for more? That's why Proverbs says, train up a child in the way that child should go. This is about equipping our children with navigational tools to help them through life, and it takes time. And it takes attention. This is not a matter of doing the equivalent of giving our children an iPhone and expecting that by having that device in their hand or the equivalent of that device, they can, because they know how to communicate with Siri or look at the maps, they can navigate their way through whatever circumstance they have in life. That's not what this is about. And it's not simply a matter of making sure your children are hanging out with Christian friends. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's important that we pay attention to the kids our kids hang out with. But I'll tell you this. That hang out and find Jesus philosophy, the idea that if you hang out with other people in a Christian environment, then the Christianity will just naturally soak in because of the people that you're around. Well, let me just say this. I think to think that your kids will find Jesus by hanging out with other Christians is foolish. It's kind of like saying, just go to school and you'll get good grades. Just walk around the hallways. Poke your head into a classroom every once in a while and you'll get good grades. That's what it's like. It takes intentional time and effort to instill in our children and in our family members a hunger and a thirst for Jesus. Train up, cultivate a thirst in your child for Jesus. Train them up in the way they should go. Well, what is this way that they should go? I'm glad you asked. I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean, well, this is the way I did it, so this is the way you should do it. I've seen that happen too many times. I pastored in Normandy for 3 years before I came here 23 years ago. And there was a member of that community that grew up in that community, went to the schools in that community, and this person was on the school board. And they were trying to make a decision to refloor the gym. And the gym was in such bad shape, if you fell, you'd get a splinter in your knee. And so there was a need to replace the gym floor. And this man said at a school board meeting, well, that gym was good enough for my kids. It was good enough for me. It ought to be good enough for these kids. And guess what? They didn't replace the gym floor. That's not what this is about. You know, I think so many of the mistakes we make in our relationships with other family members are related to that way of thinking, of treating one another in the same ways that we were treated. But here's the thing. We are all sinners. We have all failed, and we will all fail. Our parents failed in areas with us. They didn't want to, but they did. I mean, they didn't come into our bedrooms and sit down on the side of the bed and say, well, let me see how I can make a real mess of my family today, and then proceed to do it. I mean, nobody in their right mind would live like that. But here's how it happens. In spite of how positive you or I might feel in the morning as we get started on our day, something snaps. Something happens, and we all of a sudden we turn back to the habits that were formed by those who raised us, habits that were formed in them by those who raised them. And if there's no break in the cycle, we will all find ourselves just like our parents, who were just like their parents. Which leads me to say this. Every single one of us at some point must make the decision to break the cycle of unhealthy patterns that were passed down to us by our previous generations. And you may be sitting here this morning, you may be thinking, it's too late for me. My kids have already grown and gone. It's too late. Well, I want to tell you, it's never too late. Regardless of the home you've come from, regardless of the mess you think you might have made in the home you're in, it's never too late to start doing what is right. And if you don't think you have a place to start with your grandchildren. But I'll tell you where it starts personally. It starts with your relationship with Jesus. I mean, if you're a parent or a grandparent, let me ask you something. What do your children or grandchildren see in you when they consider your relationship with Jesus? Do they know that you are in an active and growing relationship with Jesus? I'm not talking about, do they see you go to church? If they were to describe what's important to you, would your relationship with Jesus be at the top of the list? This is an important question, friends. Because our children and our grandchildren, they will follow your example. And so the relationship you have with Jesus is the relationship that's going to be modeled for them and passed down for them, and they will follow that example. The great theologian Gilda Radner, for those of you who don't know who she was on Saturday Night Live. She was the Rosanna Dana character. And she wrote a book that was entitled, It's Always Something. And she said this: when I was little, Dibby told me a story about her cousin who had a dog, just a mutt, and the dog was pregnant. I don't know how long dogs are pregnant, but she was due to have her puppies in about a week. And she was out in the yard one day and got in the way of the lawnmower, and her 2 back legs got cut off. They rushed her to the vet, and the vet said, I can sew her up, or you can put her to sleep if you want, but the puppies are okay. She'll be able to deliver the puppies. And Dibby's cousin said, let's keep her alive. So the vet sewed up her backside, and over the next week, the dog learned how to walk again. She didn't spend any time worrying at all. She just learned how to walk by taking 2 steps with her front legs and then flipping her backside over, and take 2 more steps and then flip her backside over. And that's how she learned to walk. And before long, 6 little puppies were born, all in perfect health. She nursed them and weaned them. And would you believe, when they learned to walk, they all walked like her. Can you just... So it is with dogs. So it is with us. They're going to follow your example. Which takes us back to Ephesians 6. Children, honor your father and mother. This is to all of us. Not because you have to, but because you want to. And that want to is something that's nurtured. It's something that's carefully grown within. The key here is that our children and our family members will develop a hunger and a thirst for Jesus. And part of that hunger and thirst comes from what we teach. But another part of that hunger and thirst that grows up within them comes from what they see in us. And my prayer is that they will see in us and in our relationship with Jesus, they will see something that they desire for themselves. It's why Paul said to fathers, but I think it has to do with mothers as well. He said, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and in the instruction of the Lord. I like how the Message translation puts this passage. It says this: don't exasperate your children by coming down hard on them, but take them by the hand and lead them in the way of the master. Take them by the hand. That's how we make it through life, friends. We do it by holding hands and never letting go. No matter how hard, no matter how painful holding on might be, we make it through life by holding one another's hands. You plus me. It's what we've been talking about over the last 5 weeks. We need each other. God did not create us to live in isolation. He created us to live in relationship with one another. And the best way to go through life in relationship is by holding hands. With your coworkers, with your neighbors, with your fellow church members, with your friends, with your family members. Don't exasperate your children by coming down on them. Take them by the hand and lead them in the way of the master. That's our task. That's our opportunity. And may God bless all of us in that pursuit. Let's pray.